Well, welcome to week one of a Mottoverse. Now, as a bit of a tease, I had already shared some photos on social media of Art and I changing that Mottoverse at church. Now, the phrase out with the old and in with the new always brings that hope, doesn't it, for a new year. You know, the old has gone, the new will be better. We have that optimistic hope, don't we? Anyway, how could it be any worse than 2020? But I would say to you, define worse than what? Because for me, in 2020, Christ was obviously still on the throne. His grace was freely available to all of us. To me, it seemed like that maybe sleeping giant of the church actually finally reached out into places it probably could only have dreamed of reaching before. Now, personally, we made lots of new friends locally and around the world. We caught up with dear friends we might not have had time for before. And we, as I say, as a family, we celebrated Christmas twice in 2020. And we got to know our neighbours better. We had street parties and we found new ways to love one another. And for us, that was without Zoom. Now, when I unveiled the Mottoverse for 2020 last year, there were some folk that said, hey, look, we just don't get this. But I think this was God speaking directly to each of us. Now, can you remember what that verse says? I know for those that are online, you didn't actually or necessarily see it every time you came into the church building. So you're probably excused from necessarily knowing this. However, if you've been following us, hopefully you have picked it up in the messages. But for those that came into the building each week, can you remember what it said and actually where it was from? Go on, shout it out. Can you remember? Of course, it was Galatians 6:9, wasn't it? Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest, if what? We do not give up. Not only is this an encouragement to us, but I also felt this was actually a warning for some. You know, 2020's Mottoverse spoke about a harvest. And a harvest, which we love to think about sometimes, is not just about gathering a crop into a barn. Now, you see, with a harvest, it also includes a time of threshing. And sadly, some have fallen away during these times, just as our motto verse said. But I believe there was another side to this verse for each of us individually as well. And we can take this really with us into 2021. And I want to ask us a question really for this morning. You know, what do each of us need to lay upon that altar of the threshing floor? Because come on, we want that Lord of the harvest, don't we? To separate the wheat from the chaff in our lives. Come on, we want those words. I mean, more of Jesus and less of me. Holy Spirit, would you come and blow away that spiritual chaff so that as Christians we would be strong and ready to gather those souls of God's great harvest. That really excites me. You know, I've been reading a number of things I was preparing for this message, and I was reading this blog, and this is one of the things I read about in there, and it says this: for he is the one, that's God, the one who determined that Passover would come before Pentecost. You hear that? Passover would come before Pentecost. The time of threshing before the time of gathering wheat into the barns. Now, 2020 could certainly be considered a time of threshing. So what's 2021 likely to bring us? Well, the motto verse written on the walls of the church for this year is from, drumroll, it's Proverbs 3:5 through to 6. It's a passage that's actually cropped up in a number of messages throughout 2020. And one morning I woke up and I was literally waiting upon God saying, look, I'm not going to move from here until I have the motto verse for 2021. And actually this verse kept coming back to me a number of times. And when you kind of get those verses that keep coming back again and again and again, you say, I'm sure God is saying something. And this is what that Proverbs 3 verse says. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Now, I don't want to lose the energy of this verse by dissecting it to death this morning, but a number of thoughts spring from this. And then that good preaching format, I've managed to get that into 3 areas this morning. Now, as I read that verse, you probably thought, oh, he used the word submit. Well, that's going to be our first point. Submit versus maybe acknowledge. Second thing we're going to look at is obedience. And the third thing is trust this morning. So our first point comes to me based upon the use of, or our current understanding of, certain words in the English language. Now, as I was looking at different translations to signwrite actually up on the church wall, my Bible memory knowledge led me to verse 6 as being something different to what I read a moment ago. Verse 6, in all thy ways acknowledge him. But actually, as I reflected upon that, as I meditated upon that verse, I actually felt my use, and maybe your use of acknowledge, as mentioned, maybe the way society uses this word, was to acknowledge something doesn't necessarily mean to obey it. For example, we all acknowledge what 30 means on a road sign, don't we? Not more than 30 miles an hour. Same with 40 not more than 40 miles an hour. It says 70 on a motorway. Now, we all acknowledge that. We had to in order to pass our test, didn't we? But who here obeys that all of the time? Now, it's not a trick question, but this is a lawful example. And maybe over Christmas, what about all the adverts that we saw on the TV? Now, we all acknowledge there are some dreadful issues around the world with poverty, unclean water, unwell donkeys seem to appear, and so on. You know, we can acknowledge the issues, but they don't necessarily cause us to act upon them. It is as if we can acknowledge it, we give it that moment's consideration, or we could treat it as a learning moment, but it makes no impact in our actual lives. And what about a current topic? Stay at home and save lives. This is probably the most current example of acknowledgement without action for some. And look at the mess it has brought to our country and indeed the whole world. Whereas the word submit, personally to me, like in the context of this passage, always requires an action. Now, whether that's a letting go of something, whether we do something new, or simply being different, it is something we cannot just pay lip service to. It actually demands something from us. Now, other versions or translations of the Bible, the New International Reader's Version, actually translate verse 6 as in all your ways obey him. And this may I feel be an even better translation. But I went with submit. Now, something 2020 has shown me is how actually disobedient people can be. For those that have followed the guidance given to us by the government and have been as COVID safe as we could be, or COVID secure, that have listened to the advice given and we've obeyed it, it actually can be really frustrating, can't it, when we see those that do not obey. But disobedience always has consequences. Now, for the country in the short term, we are mostly in lockdown again, tier 4 for us here in Coventry at the moment. But this is not because we've all done as we've been told. You know, sadly, we see it in the newspapers and on the news, don't we? There's still a majority of people that will simply never do as they are told. And the consequences of their actions, like that naughty child in class, we were all there, weren't we, that was so naughty they wouldn't behave that everybody had to stay behind after school. Well, we're in that position as a nation, aren't we? We're all subject to the rules imposed on those that will not obey. Now, to submit actually requires some humility. Otherwise, a person will end up thinking that their leaders are wrong, and this will give birth to a critical spirit and disobedience. And this is really my second point that I'm making this morning. As Christians, we have to have, or we need to learn obedience and live it out. You know, obedience is a key quality for the Christian. Jesus is Lord of my life, not me. I am obedient to his will and his leading. And as a result of that, I live my life in a certain way. I submit to his authority and the authorities he has placed over me. Even if that is a corrupt government or we're a Roman Empire or whatever it looks like, it's not my place to say God has got it wrong and I have it right, so I'm going to do things my way. I said this in previous messages, God's ways are higher than ours, and he has the ultimate plan in hand. Who are we to say that we think our part is not that good, or rules are bad or corrupt, and therefore we will do things our way to make it better for us? You know, I raise a difficult question that if someone calls themselves a Christian and yet has authority and obedience issues, are they actually living out that Christian life? Now, you might think that's a harsh question, and it is, but we've got to look at the consequences of getting this stuff wrong, haven't we? For the Christian that daily bows the knee to God, that daily recognizes they are a sinful person, and that daily they need to put to death their sin in their lives, then the authority that Jesus has over them is a beautiful and precious thing. And obedience really comes far more easily, and actually it's something that's treasured. But for that person who says Jesus is Lord and yet disobeys the laws of the land, is in rebellion with their brothers and sisters, and they'll end up separating themselves from the church body. They will find that when the threshing comes, they are swept away. Now that breaks my heart. And it brings me on to the third point here this morning. How can we have that assurance then that we are actually in God's will? Well, our motto verse says the answer right at the beginning. It's that word trust. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean or depend on your own understanding. Jeremiah 17:9 says this, you know, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? You see, we cannot trust our own hearts to pour forth the knowledge and the wisdom that we need. No, because on our own we are deceitful and wicked. Therefore, we need to put our trust in God to overcome those internal voices and those sinful thoughts inside of us that can so easily betray us. You know, quote those words, why do I do what I don't want to do, and yet I don't do what I should do or I want to do? Now, as I was praying about this message, the blind man of Beth kept coming to mind a number of times. Now, this was our short reading a moment ago by Nikki, and it's the bit I'm focusing on there is in Mark 8:22 through to 26. And actually what struck me about this was that this seemed to be a two-stage healing. And again, we don't want to look at the Bible passages in isolation. You need to go back and read the whole of Mark 8. But at the beginning of Mark 8, we have the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000. And then after this, we see the Pharisees are there. They're ready to come and question Jesus again, try and trip him up. And in turn, that led to a rebuking of the disciples by Jesus. They got so caught up on the notion of bread, they missed the point that Jesus was making. And Mark 18:8 actually records Jesus as saying these things. Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear, and you don't remember? You see, these disciples have been with Jesus for quite a while now, and yet they were still blind. They cannot actually understand anything Jesus is saying. It is as if, like the blind man, they see something, but not in any real clarity. Maybe like trees or people walking around like trees. You know, we too can have that blurry spiritual vision, can't we? As perfection hasn't yet come in our lives. But look, we continue in Mark 8, and you get that full picture, don't you? Jesus goes on to predict his death and speaks about that way of the cross. And here we get that famous verse where Peter tries to rebuke Jesus and tell him this is not going to happen on his watch. But Jesus says in that second part of Mark 8, verse 33, these words that I'm sure we all remember well. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. You see, if we don't trust in God and we do lean on our own understanding, then actually our paths will be all over the place. Or we'll find ourselves going in circles with the same old repeated patterns of behaviour in our lives. But probably with more baggage to carry every time you go around. You see, the flip side of this, of course, is our verse for this year. Instead, we trust in the Lord with all our hearts and lean not on our own understanding. In all our ways, we will submit to Him, and He promises to make our paths straight. So, in closing, what are straight paths? We actually picked up this a little bit before. They are the places where God establishes our footsteps. I love that. He establishes our footsteps and leads us where He wants us to go. It was actually the very first point in that previous series, Cultivating Resilience. Go back and have a listen to it. Small steps, but steps in the right direction. It doesn't mean it will be easy, but it will be God's way. Now, this message or this motto verse is going to continue over the next 3 weeks, and I've actually got some folk from church that are going to join in and share some of their thoughts and reflections as well, that as a congregation we can press into. But I just want to sum up this message, this motto verse this week, just in 2 words, and it begins like our motto verse with trust, and it ends in Him. These things I want to leave with you this morning. 2 words. Trust Him. Trust Him. Trust Him.